What's good, people? A few weeks ago I arrived in my 50th country. It's not really a milestone I ever thought I'd reach because I've never really been interested in seeing as many countries as possible. I've only really just gone to places I thought were interesting, but I guess it kind of is nice to know that I've seen like a few places now. So this 50th country is Suriname, which is a small country on the Atlantic coast of South America, right at the top near Caribbean countries like Grenada and Trinidad and Tobago. And right now I'm in the capital, Paramaribo. Suriname is part of what's known as the three Guianas, which are Suriname, French Guiana and Guyana. And it's quite an interesting region because at the time of European colonization of the Americas, the five colonizers, the British, Spanish, Portuguese, French and the Dutch, they all had interest in this region for one reason or the other over a period of time. And after like years of conflict, it was divided into like 5 different areas. So on the west you had Spanish Guiana, which later became part of Venezuela. Next to that you had British Guiana, which is now Guyana. Next to that it was Dutch Guiana, which is now Suriname, French Guiana, and then Portuguese Guiana, which is now the state of Amapá in Brazil. And that's just briefly what went on. Like the details might not be exact, but went something like that. And now they're just known as the three Guianas. And it's also an interesting region because it's the only non-Spanish or Portuguese speaking region in the whole of South America, and also the least documented. And I say least documented because I'm not really one of those people that makes how-to videos when it comes to traveling. Like there's a lot of people on YouTube I feel like do that very well, so I would just be repeating what they say. But for these 3 countries, the information I was finding was few and far between. Like I couldn't really find anything, and a lot of it was like 2 years old. And obviously in the travel world, something that was a certain way 2 years ago, it might not even exist anymore. So after I'd gone through the process and on the ground had to figure out how I was going to move around, I thought it might be a good thing to make this video and offer some advice to people who are interested in going to these places. I'd say the lack of tourism's partially because there's not many travel options to get here compared to other South American countries like Brazil and Colombia and Peru. And also the accommodation is very expensive. Like it's hard to find cheap accommodation, and on top of that it's quite limited. And also these 3 countries have rivers leading to the ocean from the Amazon basin, which just makes the water very murky. So I'd say that affects the tourism here too. I'm currently residing in Brazil, but only on a tourist visa, so it's like 2 times 90 days a year. So what I usually do is I'll just stay like 2 months and then I'll just go traveling for 2 months. And this is the same thing I did while I was living in Colombia. So a few months back I was thinking of where to go, and I was deciding, should I just go to Santiago in Chile? It was an easy direct flight from Rio, or should I be a bit more adventurous and go to French Guiana like Suriname? So for me personally, I would never pay long haul flight prices to get to neighboring countries, because when I was in Colombia, I looked into like visiting Guyana and Suriname and stuff, but the flights were always some super crazy prices. But fortunately in Brazil, there's 2 cities, which are Belém in the state of Pará and Fortaleza in the state of Ceará. And from these 2 cities, you can get direct flights to Cayenne in French Guiana for like $100 with a Sol airline. So yeah, I just decided that's where I was gonna go. I'd been to Fortaleza on my way back to the UK in April, so I thought I might as well fly from Belém. And in Brazil, internal flights are actually quite decent. Like a connecting flight from Rio to Belém is probably $80 to $100, and you have to bear in mind that's a 2,000-mile journey. There's a few cool things to do in Belém, but while I was there, I just chilled most of the time. I was only there for a couple of days, and I'd arrived there from Salvador, where I'd been with my girlfriend, just traveling around every day for like a week. So by the time I got to Belém, I just wanted to chill. But if you're spending more time there, you can do like jungle tours and get boats to different islands and things like that. There's only 1 flight per week from Belém to Cayenne, and it leaves on Sunday at 2 p.m. So if you got like dollars or Brazilian reais, I would suggest that you change them on the Saturday, because on the Sunday, the exchanges aren't open early enough for you to change money and also make the flight. So otherwise, then you'd have to change at the airport, because you'll need euros when you get to Cayenne. And if you're changing at the airport, obviously they always have a terrible exchange rate, so it's basically just giving away money if you don't change it early enough. I think it was like an hour and a half from Belém to Cayenne, which is not that long, because obviously Belém's like way in the north of Brazil, close to the border of French Guiana. If you didn't know, French Guiana is actually a department of France, so it's actually part of the EU, so it uses euros, as I mentioned before. So if you got an EU passport, you can just like breeze through immigration, and while I was there, it looked like it was about half an hour long. But unfortunately, on Sundays, there's no public transport service whatsoever. And this makes it difficult, because the only option is to take a taxi, but the taxis are like unbelievably priced. They're just ridiculous. Like, to get from the airport to Cayenne is 50 euros. Or if you're staying at a hotel or like you got an Airbnb, maybe you can work something out with them for like slightly cheaper. But 50 euros for a 20-minute journey, obviously that's extortionate. Fortunately, there was a couple of other travellers like me waiting like to figure out a way to get there. So we just shared a taxi, and then it ended up being like 17 euros between us. And I'll say you could easily do this, because the flight's only once per week, and there'll always be people on that flight trying to figure out how they can get to Cayenne. I booked an Airbnb close to this square called Place des Palmiste. Like, I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, so don't criticize me for that. But yeah, when I got to it, I realized this is probably the best area to stay, because it's very, very central and close to a lot of things. To move around, I would say you probably need to hire a car. Otherwise, you're not really going to see much outside the centre, because there's not really much of a public bus service. And obviously, you'd either have to walk for miles or pay those extortionate taxi prices. So yeah, the centre itself is actually quite nice. There's colonial buildings and things like that, but besides that, there's not many food options or even bar options. Like, the city is just very quiet and mundane, so I was only there for 3 days, and I was actually glad. I would have stayed there like probably 2 days if I could. But anyway, for those 3 days, I was trying to figure out how I would get to the city called Kourou. And Kourou is probably the main reason why people visit French Guiana, because it's a location of the Guiana Space Centre, which is the launch site for European space projects due to its geographical location. I asked a couple of people how I could get to the city, and they literally said you have to wait on this main road and like flag for a lift. I just couldn't accept that was the only viable option to get there. So I asked a couple more people, and one guy from a travel agency said there's a little bus station where you can catch this bus that goes there. So I walked over to the bus station, and it was near Chinatown, just on the edge of Chinatown, but there was not really anyone there. Like, the few people I asked didn't really know much, so I went back the next day, and luckily there was this like black Mercedes Sprinter van with a digitizer on the top that said Kourou. So I spoke to the driver, and the driver said that the bus leaves every 2 hours from like 6 a.m. So I was happy then, like, I figured this out. But then I had another dilemma. Like, the Airbnb that I was staying at, the woman, she said that I couldn't check in until 5 p.m. Like, she wasn't even gonna be there for me to drop my bags, which was an issue because I booked a tour at the Space Centre for 1 p.m. I was probably gonna arrive in Kourou like 11, but I'll be coming with all my bags and stuff, and obviously like that would be an awkward situation with all my bags going to this tour. So what I did is I just hired a car, and for how expensive this country is, like, to hire a car is not that bad. It was like 35 euros for the day, which worked out perfectly because I would have somewhere to leave my bags. I'd have a way to get to and from the Space Centre. And like, if I'd used a taxi, it would have been more than 35 euros to get there and back anyway. So luckily I had all this booked by the last night. So the next morning I walked over to the bus station, which was like 5 minutes from that square I was talking about. And when I got there was like a lot of people waiting. And then you had people walking past, like shouting different destinations, which I've seen in other Caribbean countries. But here, people were just doing this with their own personal cars. After a few more minutes, a Guyanese woman walked over and she shouted Kourou, so I hailed her. And it was just like a small car, there was a couple other people in there, but it was an easy journey. It was only like an hour long and it cost 10 euros, which I think is a standard fee as it's what I would have paid to take the bus. She dropped me outside the car rental place, which was just on the edge of the city. It was jumbo cars. So then I just got some food and then went to the Space Centre, which was like 5 minutes from the city. Everywhere there is like 5-10 minutes at the most. It's a very small city. The tour itself was cool. There's not really anything like a Space Centre tour because it's like the size of a city, but everything's kept like so pristine. And there's all these unique buildings like dotted around miles from each other. It looks kind of strange. It actually reminds me of like an old James Bond movie where they've got a laboratory in the middle of the jungle kind of thing. But yeah, besides that, I wouldn't really say I'm like someone who's really into space, but the tour was free, but very thorough. Like it lasted, I would say at least 3 hours, and they drive you around in like an air-conditioned bus, so it was quite a good thing to do. The only thing I would say is that like if you want to do this tour, you basically have to book like weeks in advance because you can't just turn up and do it. Obviously it's a very secure unit and you have to send your details and everyone needs to be vetted and things like that. And also on the day that I did it, it was practically full, so obviously you want to make sure you secure that space for when you plan to be there. One other thing people do when they're in Kourou is go to this island called Devil's Island. I think it was like some old prison island for the French, but now it's just ruins and then you've got monkeys and stuff on there. I planned to do this the next day, but the issue I had was that there's only one boat that leaves at 8 in the morning and I had to take the car back that day, but the car rental place didn't actually open until 8:30, so it just made it impossible. So if you plan to go to that island, just make sure if you've got a hire car, you don't have to take it back on the same day because nowhere in Kourou opens early. So that day I just chilled, and before I dropped off the car I went to see the sunrise at this place called Puente des Roches. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced either, so don't criticize me for that one. But yeah, there was this like cool lighthouse kind of thing called Dreyfus Tower. So I just spent the morning there and then dropped off the car. And the next day I was gonna continue west to Suriname and finish in the capital, Paramaribo. This was another headache now because I couldn't figure out how I could get to the border city, Saint Laurent du Maroni, like due to the lack of information. There was no public bus and not really any transfer service that I could see to contact online. But luckily, like I spoke to my host and she knew like a transfer service that I could book. It was like 25 euros to take me to Saint Laurent. So the next morning we left at like 6 a.m, got picked up that time, and then he picked up a few other people. And we got there around 9 a.m. and he dropped me back outside immigration for French Guiana. So they checked my passport, and then taxi drivers come up to you as soon as you get out of the taxi really saying, do you need like transport across the river because it's a river border, and then also a transfer to Paramaribo. And when they see that you're tourist, obviously they'll try and quote you some crazy prices, but basically the standard fee is 4 euros across the river. And then after that it's 8 euros if you want to take your own taxi, or 20 euros per person in a shared taxi. It took like 10-15 minutes to get across the river, and from there I headed to Suriname immigration. And one thing you need to know if you've got a European or like US Canadian passport, you'll need a tourist card which will need to be pre-approved. And I think you can get this on arrival if you're flying into Suriname, but if you're going across a land border like I did, I don't think this is possible. And while I was in immigration, it looked crazy in there too, like I wouldn't want to even chance having to get that in there. So what I did is I went to the Suriname Consulate while I was in Cayenne. It was right next to that square that I mentioned, and it cost 37 euros and it took like 5 minutes. All you need is your passport and yellow fever certificate. So it was a quick stamp in the Suriname immigration, and then from there it took like 2 hours to get to Paramaribo. Suriname is very different to any other South American country because even though the official language is Dutch, like on a day-to-day basis you don't hear people communicating in Dutch that much. Like they speak in this Creole language called Sranantong, which is like a mixture of different languages but based off like English. But also you have like other languages, like another one I know is Saramacan, which is also a mix of different languages, but based off Portuguese. One other thing is that most people speak English, like I think they learn it in school. So if you don't speak Spanish or Portuguese and you're visiting South America, then I guess this is useful for you. The city of Paramaribo itself, like besides the logistics of actually getting here, like it's hard to see why there's such little tourism, because it's a really beautiful city. It's actually one of the most beautiful cities I've seen, at least one of the most beautiful capitals I've seen in South America, because the whole city is like an old town, like it's just mostly old Dutch colonial buildings that are all made of like wood. Even the houses are all made of wood, but they're all very well maintained. And it's also very cheap, because I think the currency is like dropped in the last few years. So yeah, that's just a little rundown on how I made it from Brazil to Suriname. So hopefully it makes it easier for anyone planning to do this trip. I'm out of here. Peace.